Autumn, 1888. A city on the cusp of a new century, yet still clinging to the shadows of its past. London, the heart of a vast global empire, was a city of startling, often brutal, contrasts. Opulence and squalor existed side by side, nowhere more strikingly than in the East End. This was a sprawling, suffocating labyrinth of narrow, unlit streets and crowded courts where poverty, disease, and desperation festered like an open wound. This forgotten, neglected district was Whitechapel, a place about to be etched into the darkest annals of infamy, forever associated with a name that continues to chill the blood over a century later, Jack the Ripper. The year began like any other, marked by the usual grind of poverty and petty crime. But by late August, a new, unprecedented kind of terror had begun its silent stalk through the shadowed alleys. A series of brutal and calculated murders would not only plunge the most powerful city in the world into a state of acute panic, but would also savagely expose the hypocrisy, neglect, and systemic failures at the heart of Victorian society. The crimes challenged the very fabric of law and order, proving that even the mighty British Empire could not protect its most vulnerable citizens from a solitary, unseen predator. Our journey into the darkness must begin here, in the cold heart of Whitechapel, where the first terrified whispers of a monster soon turned into a deafening roar of fear and public outrage. The events of 1888 would not only define a killer who was never caught, but they would forever change how we view crime, how investigations are conducted, and, perhaps most profoundly, they established the enduring, terrifying power of the unsolved mystery. To truly grasp the horror that unfolded, we must first understand the world of Whitechapel itself. It was a place teeming with life, yet perpetually on the brink of collapse. Overcrowding was rampant, with tenement houses and common lodging houses, known grimly as doss houses, packed with multiple families and scores of transient residents, often sleeping 3 or 4 to a single room. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Open sewers and cesspools were common, ensuring that disease, particularly cholera and tuberculosis, was a constant, deadly threat. For those living there, life was a daily, exhausting struggle for bare existence. For many women, especially those without family support or employment, prostitution was not a choice, but a grim necessity, a desperate, last-ditch bid for survival in a harsh, unyielding society that offered them little to no alternative. This environment, a crucible of endemic poverty, moral decay, and institutional neglect, provided the perfect hunting ground for a predator. The authorities, primarily the Metropolitan Police, or the Met, in conjunction with the smaller City of London Police, struggled constantly to maintain even a semblance of order in such a volatile, densely packed district. Their limited resources were stretched thin, their methods were often outdated and rudimentary, and they were fundamentally ill-equipped to handle the unprecedented savagery, precision, and psychological warfare that was about to descend upon the community. London in 1888 was a study in profound social stratification. The West End, with its grand boulevards, exclusive clubs, and opulent theatres, represented the self-proclaimed pinnacle of British civilization and imperial might. The East End, however, was its dark, polluted mirror, a forgotten, ignored corner where the strict moral and social codes of Victorian society often buckled completely under the sheer, brutal weight of poverty and desperation. It was here, amidst the smoky gloom of the gin palaces, the squalor of the lodging houses, and the shadows of the countless narrow streets and courts. That the terrifying legend of Jack the Ripper would be born and immortalized.
Clear the street now! They'll never catch him in this fog.
The historical narrative of the Ripper murders often begins on August 31st, 1888, with the discovery of Mary Ann Nichols in a desolate, dark stretch of Bucks Row. However, it is crucial to note the earlier attacks, known collectively as the Whitechapel murders, which had occurred throughout the year. The savage murder of Martha Tabram in early August, though not definitively linked, shared the brutal characteristic of multiple stab wounds. But it was Nichols' death that truly ignited the public terror and set the distinct, gruesome tone for the weeks to come. Mary Ann Nichols, known to her acquaintances as Polly, was a 43-year-old prostitute and chronic alcoholic, recently separated from her husband. She was discovered shortly before 400 a.m. Her throat had been brutally cut with 2 deep incisions, virtually severing her windpipe and arteries. More chillingly, her abdomen was severely mutilated with deep, jagged wounds. The savagery of the attack was horrifying, shocking even to the local constabulary, who were hardened to the grim realities of Whitechapel crime. This was a new level of ferocity and rage. Dr. Henry Ward, the divisional surgeon, was one of the first medical professionals at the scene. His initial examination, conducted by the weak light of a police lantern, revealed the horrifying extent of the injuries. The wounds, particularly the throat cuts, were precise and almost clinically placed, suggesting a degree of anatomical knowledge or great skill with a knife. This chilling detail, the methodical, seemingly surgical nature of the mutilation, would quickly become a defining, recurring, and utterly terrifying signature of the killer. Just over a week later, on September 8th, the nightmare intensified, confirming the presence of a methodical predator. Annie Chapman, another impoverished woman, was found murdered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her throat was cut, and her body was mutilated with an even greater degree of precision and deliberation than Nichols. The killer had operated with more time and chilling audacity. What made Chapman's case particularly disturbing and immediately drew wider media attention was the removal of certain internal organs, specifically the uterus. This act sent a horrifying and unmistakable message to the police and the public. This was no ordinary, impulsive killer driven by passion or petty robbery. This was someone driven by a dark, unfathomable compulsion, perhaps a hatred so deep it required the destruction of the victim's inner self. The fear in Whitechapel, already palpable, now began to escalate into full-blown panic. The terror reached its peak with the unprecedented event known as the double event on the morning of September 30th. First, Elizabeth Stride was found shortly after 100 a.m. in Dutfield's Yard, off Burner Street. Her throat was cut, but notably, there was no abdominal mutilation. It is widely believed that the killer was interrupted before he could complete his gruesome ritual, perhaps by a passing cart or person. The killer's immediate, frantic response was to seek another victim. Barely 45 minutes later, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square, a short distance away, inside the jurisdiction of the City of London Police. Her throat was cut. Her face and abdomen were horrifically and extensively mutilated. This time, the killer had worked unhurriedly and with great malice, removing her left kidney and a part of her uterus. The proximity of these 2 murders, committed within an hour of each other, in 2 different police districts, demonstrated the killer's almost unbelievable audacity, speed, and mastery of the area. Whitechapel was no longer just a district of poverty. It was, undeniably, a hunting ground. The name? Jack the Ripper, soon to be sensationalized in the press, was about to explode into the public consciousness, terrifying all of London and captivating the entire world. The Metropolitan Police, initially under the impression they were dealing with isolated acts of Whitechapel violence, were rapidly and comprehensively overwhelmed. Their prevailing policing methods, which largely relied on beat constables, local informants and routine patrols, proved catastrophically inadequate against a killer who left behind frustratingly little in the way of forensic evidence and struck with terrifying, calculated speed. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, a seasoned and capable officer from Scotland Yard, was brought in to lead the investigation. Despite his extensive experience in handling serious crimes, he faced immense, almost insurmountable challenges. Crucially, the crime scenes were contaminated almost immediately. In the dense Whitechapel district, large, frenzied crowds of curious onlookers, residents, and reporters would gather within minutes, trampling over vital clues and destroying any subtle evidence that might have been present. The technology available for forensic analysis was, by modern standards, painfully rudimentary and unreliable. There was no concept of DNA analysis. The systematic collection and comparison of fingerprints was only just beginning to be explored in theory, and was not standard practice. And the entire protocol for crime scene preservation was virtually non-existent. Investigators were reduced to relying on witness testimony, which was often confused or contradictory, and microscopic analysis of physical objects, which yielded few conclusive results. The physical landscape of Whitechapel also actively worked against the police. Its warren-like streets, cramped courts, and tightly packed lodging houses provided countless escape routes and hiding places. Furthermore, the anonymity and transient nature of its inhabitants made identifying potential witnesses an incredibly difficult task. The thousands of people who moved through the district daily, many of them prostitutes, beggars, or petty criminals, were often unwilling or desperately afraid to cooperate with the very authorities they viewed as part of their oppression. Compounding these investigative difficulties was the growing public hysteria. Sensationalist newspaper reports, often grossly exaggerated, speculative, and driven by a fierce rivalry for sales, fueled the fear across the city. Every shadow held a potential threat, every strange figure was the potential killer. This media frenzy created a corrosive cycle. The police struggled, the press criticized, and the public's trust in the authorities began to erode dramatically, replaced by a profound and paralyzing sense of vulnerability and anger. The continued failure to apprehend the killer after multiple, shockingly similar murders led to widespread accusations of incompetence and systemic failure. High-ranking officials, including the Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, faced intense public and political pressure. The desperate, unsuccessful hunt for Jack the Ripper became a potent symbol of Victorian society's inability, or perhaps its unwillingness, to protect its most marginalized and vulnerable citizens. The police were working in the dark, metaphorically and literally, struggling to solve a crime that transcended their methods and their imagination. As the dark, cold autumn of 1888 deepened, another chilling and psychological dimension was added to the Ripper saga: the letters. Dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of letters claiming to be from the killer flooded police stations, newspaper offices, and even the offices of charitable committees. Most of these, the police correctly ascertained, were cruel hoaxes, pranks designed by attention seekers and unscrupulous individuals eager to exploit the tidal wave of public terror and media interest. Yet, a few of these communications stood out, becoming infamous elements of the enduring legend, fueling the terror and giving the killer a voice. The first letter of note, received by the Central News Agency on September 27th, was signed Jack the Ripper. This chilling communication, with its distinctly mocking and taunting tone, openly boasted about the killings and promised future atrocities. Crucially, it bestowed upon the anonymous killer his enduring, terrifying moniker. It was a brand, a viral identity created by the media and the killer himself, which resonated instantly with the public's darkest fears and sensationalized imagination. Another key letter, the so-called Dear Boss letter, was also received by the Central News Agency and was postmarked September 29th. In it, the writer chillingly promised to clip the ears off the next victim. Police initially remained skeptical, continuing to dismiss these notes as hoaxes. But the subsequent murder of Catherine Eddowes hours later, particularly the partial severing of her earlobe, gave the letter a terrifying, undeniable new significance. The police were forced to acknowledge the chilling possibility that they were corresponding with the monster. Perhaps the most macabre communication of all was the From Hell letter, received by George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, on October 16th. This ghastly package contained not only a short, crudely written letter, but also a small, preserved human kidney. The accompanying text claimed that it was from one of the women, and that the sender had fried and ate it. While contemporary forensic analysis was unable to conclusively determine whether the kidney belonged to Catherine Eddowes, some doctors believed it did. Others were doubtful. The sheer audacity, personal nature, and gruesomeness of the From Hell letter sent a genuine shockwave through London society. It seemed to confirm the killer's monstrous, inhuman nature and his deliberate, mocking intent to engage in a psychological war with the very authorities trying to capture him. These infamous letters, regardless of whether they were all genuinely penned by the killer, served a powerful, essential function. They amplified the legend of Jack the Ripper. They personalized the terror, giving a voice, however twisted and disturbing, to the unseen, untouchable monster. They cemented his unique place in history, not just as a killer, but as a cunning, elusive tormentor who openly, publicly, and successfully mocked his pursuers and the might of the British Empire. The horrifying climax of the Ripper's reign of terror arrived on the morning of November 9, 1888, with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. This attack represented a chilling escalation of the violence and audacity that had defined the previous murders. Unlike the first 4 victims, who were attacked rapidly in open, public spaces, Kelly was murdered in her own room. A small, miserable, single-room dwelling at 13 Millers Court, a small, cramped lodging off Dorset Street. Mary Kelly, a young woman in her mid-20s, was the Ripper's youngest victim and, arguably, the most brutally and extensively mutilated. Her body was discovered by her landlord's assistant, who broke down the door after rent was overdue and saw the horrific scene through a broken windowpane. The scene inside the small, enclosed room was one of unimaginable, almost cinematic horror. The killer had operated over a period of many hours, safely concealed from the world. He had performed an extensive, almost ritualistic dissection of the body. Her heart was removed from the chest cavity, and her internal organs, including the liver and intestines, were strewn about the room and placed on a bedside table. The sheer scale and meticulous nature of the mutilation suggested a killer who was either in a frenzy of uncontrolled rage or, more terrifyingly, engaging in a chillingly methodical process, possibly driven by a deep, dark sexual or pathological desire. The discovery of Mary Kelly's body sent a fresh, unprecedented wave of shock, nausea, and revulsion throughout London. The sheer audacity of the killer, to operate within the absolute confines of a private, contained room, undisturbed, for hours, was beyond comprehension. It solidified the horrific image of a monster who was not merely lurking in the shadows, but one who was capable of invading and defiling the most private, supposedly safe spaces. Public faith in the police reached its nadir. People openly spoke of a killer who was either a demon or a genius. The police launched a frantic, comprehensive search, combing the entire area and setting up an extensive cordon. However, the killer had long since vanished. The extensive mutilation meant that few of the original characteristics of the victim were intact, complicating identification, though Kelly was positively identified soon after. This murder, so extreme in its brutality and so shocking in its locale, marked a distinct turning point. It was the last universally accepted, canonical, Ripper murder. After the discovery of Mary Kelly, the killings suddenly, inexplicably, stopped. The monster of Whitechapel vanished as quickly and mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving behind a trail of psychological terror, 5 dead women, and an enduring, unresolved enigma that has haunted law enforcement and historians ever since. The absence of further attacks only deepened the mystery. Did the killer die? Or was he arrested for a different crime? Did he commit suicide? Or did he simply move on? With the official investigation hitting a prolonged, frustrating dead end, the vacuum of official knowledge was immediately filled by rampant speculation, folklore, and sensationalism. Over the decades since 1888, hundreds of potential suspects have been proposed, each with a compelling, detailed, yet ultimately unprovable, narrative. The absolute lack of concrete. Modern forensic evidence has allowed for a vast proliferation of theories, turning the Ripper case into a highly competitive and often sensationalized field for armchair detectives, historians, and true crime enthusiasts, the Ripperologists, worldwide. One of the most persistent and enduring theories centers on Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish barber and resident of Whitechapel. He was identified by 2 key figures in the investigation, Chief Inspector Swanson and Assistant Chief Constable Robert Anderson, as a prime suspect. Anderson later noted that a key witness, also Jewish, had positively identified Kosminski but had refused to testify in court, possibly due to the intense anti-Semitism of the time. Kosminski was later committed to an asylum, suffering from paranoid delusions, a mental collapse that coincided with the end of the murders. Recent, highly controversial DNA analysis performed on a shawl, purportedly found at a crime scene has pointed to Kosminski. Though the results remain highly disputed by the scientific community due to issues with evidence continuity and contamination. Another prominent theory often focuses on Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who was known to have family members with a history of mental illness. He drowned himself in the River Thames shortly after the last canonical murder, a death that conveniently coincided with the cessation of the attacks. A senior police official privately named Druitt as a potential suspect, describing him as a maniac. However, there has never been any direct, verifiable evidence linking Druitt to the crimes, making his inclusion circumstantial at best, based primarily on the timeline of his death. More sensational, and often less credible, theories have reached for figures from the highest echelons of Victorian society. These include Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, Queen Victoria's grandson, often woven into elaborate Masonic conspiracy theories involving court physicians and cover-ups. While highly captivating, these grand conspiracy narratives generally lack any credible evidentiary basis and are often considered historical fiction driven by the desire for a dramatic conclusion. Other plausible and less plausible suspects have included medical practitioners with anatomical knowledge, such as the American Dr. Francis Tumblety, or painters and artists like Walter Sickert, whose artistic obsession with the Whitechapel murders led many to suspect he was hiding a dark secret. The sheer volume, diversity, and often emotional conviction surrounding these various theories highlight the case's power to tantalize and challenge. Ultimately, what unifies all these diverse, conflicting theories is a common, frustrating thread, though: the absolute absence of definitive, irrefutable proof. Without a clear confession, without a reliable, unimpeachable witness, and without the benefit of modern forensic analysis, the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains shrouded forever in the thick, cold mists of speculation. The case is an enduring puzzle with too many missing, damaged, or misleading pieces. The crucial question of why the Jack the Ripper case remains unsolved is not simply a matter of academic curiosity. It is central to its enduring and terrifying power in popular culture. A perfect, tragic storm of factors conspired to ensure the killer would forever evade the grasp of justice. Factors that offer a grim, sobering lesson in the limitations of Victorian law enforcement and society. Firstly, the primitive nature of forensic science in 1888 was the single most crippling handicap. As noted, DNA analysis was centuries away, and even basic fingerprinting was not yet routine. Crucially, the prevailing attitude of the police meant that a suspect was caught by patrol, not by patient scientific analysis. Crime scenes were treated poorly, with little regard for minute evidence like fibers, hairs, or trace blood, which were likely lost or destroyed within minutes of the initial gruesome discovery. Secondly, the specific social environment of Whitechapel created a perfect operational haven for the killer. The district's vast, transient population, the widespread fear and hatred of the police, who were often seen as an oppressive force, and the general culture of self-preservation among the poor created an effective wall of silence. Witnesses were often unreliable, impaired by alcohol, suffering from trauma, or simply too terrified of either the police or the killer to come forward and testify truthfully. Thirdly, the audacity, speed, and seeming intelligence of the killer were unparalleled. To commit such horrific, time-consuming acts in what were essentially public spaces, often under the immediate cover of darkness and fog, and then to vanish without leaving a detectable trace, speaks to a killer who was either incredibly lucky or possessed a chillingly intimate knowledge of the local geography, police patrol patterns, and escape routes. He used the chaos and darkness of London against the police. Fourthly, the overwhelming public hysteria and media frenzy, while understandable given the barbarity of the crimes, actively hindered the investigation. Hoax letters diverted massive amounts of police time and precious resources. More damagingly, the sensationalist press reports routinely clouded the official facts with wild, often conflicting fiction, making it nearly impossible for investigators to distinguish a genuine, reliable lead from baseless rumor or malevolent speculation. The case of Jack the Ripper, thus, stands as a stark and dramatic reminder of a time when the forces of law and order were fundamentally outmatched by a cunning, unseen enemy who exploited the technological limitations and social weaknesses of a great city. It is a profound historical story of human fallibility, a society grappling with its own internal dark underbelly, and a monster who successfully slipped through the cracks of a nascent, ill-equipped justice system. Over a century and 3 decades have passed since the terrifying autumn of 1888 in Whitechapel. Yet the legend of Jack the Ripper continues to utterly fascinate, compel, and horrify the world. His name has transcended the grim confines of true crime to become a pervasive cultural touchstone, the quintessential symbol of the ultimate unsolved mystery, the personification of pure, unadulterated evil lurking in the unseen corners of civilization. Crucially, the Ripper case served as a harsh catalyst for change. The high-profile, catastrophic failure of the investigation paved the way for the development of modern criminal investigation techniques. It forced authorities in London and around the world to fundamentally re-evaluate their methods, compelling them to eventually embrace new forensic tools, formalizing the need for strict crime scene preservation, systematic evidence collection, and a far more scientific, objective approach to solving violent crime. The victims of the Ripper, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, women who were once dehumanized, ignored, and forgotten by Victorian society, have also, ironically, found a voice through the enduring interest in their fate. Modern historians and authors have diligently worked to bring their impoverished, complicated, and desperately sad life stories to light, transforming them from mere statistics and body counts into real, complex women who lived and died in the brutal, unforgiving landscape of Victorian London. But perhaps the most profound and terrifying legacy of Jack the Ripper is the enduring psychological unease he continues to evoke. He remains a faceless, shapeless phantom, a terrifying void into which we, as a society, project our deepest, most visceral fears about the unknown, about the darkness that can exist, silent and unseen, within the heart of humanity. He is the monster under the bed of history, the anonymous evil that proves that some crimes can, and do, go unpunished. The metaphorical fog of Whitechapel may have long since cleared, the original gas lamps replaced by the harsh certainty of electric light. But the long, cold shadows cast by Jack the Ripper still relentlessly linger. His story is not just a police file, it is a chilling, cautionary reminder that some mysteries are destined to remain perpetually unsolved, forever haunting the collective imagination. A dark, definitive chapter in history that, despite all modern efforts, resolutely refuses to close.